Hi everybody. So a few years ago, back in the days when we had a dog, I was walking the dog with a friend of mine, and we were up on Highdown Hill in Worthing, where the hill overlooks the sea one side and the South Downs the other, and it's just a beautiful place. And it was a beautiful spring morning. It was early, about 8 o'clock, and there was nobody else up there, and it was just one of those glorious days. And as we came round the tree line, we just saw the most, horrible devastation from a party that had obviously taken place up there the night before. There were beer bottles and cans and those temporary barbecues, and the silver foil was everywhere, and the grills were everywhere, and there was charcoal everywhere, and then there was all these burger packets and chicken nugget packets, and it was a right old state. There must have been 30 or 40 people partying up there the night before. It was an enormous mess. And there was another lady walking her dog just ahead of us, and she put her hands on her hips, and I heard her say in an audible voice, "I can't do anything about them, but I can do something about me." And I thought, I like this woman. So Mark and I went over to her, and she was all ready. She got a plastic bag out of her pocket, and she's now trying to collect up all these beer cans and bottles and everything. And Mark and I joined in, and between the three of us, we just about managed to get the mess cleared up and took it down to the local bins. And as we were walking down, I said, "So tell me about what you said." And she said, "It was a phrase my mother taught me. She said, when everything goes wrong in the world, we have to take our responsibility. Yeah, I can't do anything about them, but I can do something about me." And we got into a very interesting conversation. That chimes with the Christian understanding of what's gone wrong in the world and the evil and the problems that we face. The great Russian writer Solzhenitsyn said that the problems of evil don't run through political parties or nation states or even empires. The problem of evil runs through every human heart. And basically, the trouble with the world is me. We, however good our hearts are, there are these unruly places of evil in all of them. And the Christian teaching is that basically the world is in the mess it's in because we as human beings have given into the temptations that kind of lurk deep down in all of us. And so this last couple of weeks, we've been looking at this issue of temptation. We've been asking the question, if it's that destructive, how on earth do we resist it? And we're going to continue that teaching tonight by looking again at Matthew chapter 4 and the second temptation of Jesus. And this message is called Trust. Now, let's just quickly recap on where we've been so far in the series, because we called week 1 High Stakes. We said that there is always more at stake when we are tempted than we realize in the moment. It certainly was true of Jesus. You and I were in the balance. The whole of the future of the universe hung in the balance. And it's true every time you and I face temptation. The great lie of temptation is it's just this once and it's just about me. And it's never just this once and it's never just about me. And we looked at in that first week about how temptation damages ourselves, it damages our faith, and it damages the people that we love the most. One of the ways we fail to love our neighbour is that we give in to our personal temptations, because the ramifications of that always impacts those closest to us. And I was encouraging everybody in that first week, as we looked at the high stakes of temptation, how it impacts us, the people we love, and our futures, our faith, to develop the mantra that Andy Stanley teaches, where we simply say when we're facing temptation, you will not have my future, you will not have my faith, you will not have my family. And then in week 2, we talked about the story behind the story. And the alarming thing is that most people are clueless to defend themselves against temptation, because we simply don't understand how it works. We have to know our enemy and how temptation hooks into and becomes such a threat to our lives. And we learnt how that in each one of the temptations Jesus faced lies one of the temptations that we face. And the first temptation was that Jesus was invited to turn stones into bread when he was starving. And we said that all of us are tempted to different things, but what temptation has in common for all of us is these things. Number one, temptation is always disguised as our self-interest. That temptation always whispers, "This will make you feel better." It always promises to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way. It always pretends to alleviate our pain, and temptation will appear to us to be self-medication, but actually it's like drinking poison. And so this week we pick up the story, having looked at what's at stake and at how temptation works. In the third part of this series, we begin to look at some of the strategies we can adopt to resist temptation, again, based on this passage from Matthew chapter 4. And we're going to learn that at the root of every temptation is a trust in God issue. So this week is called trust. But just before we get into the text, I want to say something again for those who will be listening to this who, you're not followers of Jesus. You're curious about Christianity perhaps. You're exploring the claims of faith. And I think there are some really important things just to say about temptation for people who are in that place on their spiritual journey. And the thing to say is this: look, temptation is a really loaded word. The very word temptation carries with it a whole bunch of presuppositions about the nature of right and wrong, about the place of desire in human experience, about the place of evil in the world. And I don't for a moment assume that you buy into those presuppositions. So you are off the hook in terms of the teaching of this story in this passage. But what I would encourage you to do is to continue to ask yourself the question, when I look back on the mistakes that I've made in my life, is this how it went wrong? Is this teaching around temptation, does it chime with the reality of my experience? Because that'll be quite enlightening, I think, and will help you weigh up whether this Jesus really is the way, the truth, and the life, and someone to follow. But just a couple of things in passing about the text we're going to look at. Because I think that by just simply looking at the way this story is written, it does give some indicators that actually the Bible is a reliable historical source of information about the life of Jesus Christ. What makes me say that about Matthew chapter 4? Well, three things. The first is that the temptations of Jesus are recorded at length in two of the four Gospels, in Matthew here and in Luke chapter 4. And what's interesting is that the second and third temptations are reversed in Luke. And in Luke, there are some additional words recorded that the devil doesn't say in Matthew. Now, if the Bible was a kind of, an edited kind of con job, a kind of fix, that would have been a pretty straightforward edit that people would have noticed. But actually, it's far more consistent and in keeping with everything we've learnt about how eyewitness accounts get recorded, where some of the things that happen out of sequence, but all the main themes are the same. The second thing that suggests to me that this is a reliable retelling of the story is that if someone was going to come up with the temptations of Jesus and imagine what they were, they'd come up with different ones to these. These are pretty niche. They're pretty odd, actually, and they don't suggest to me any traits of a kind of a post kind of storytelling. And the third thing to say is this: I have never been tempted to turn stones into bread. And the reason I haven't been tempted to turn stones into bread is that it is not remotely possible for me to do so. Can you imagine how bonkers this early account of the life of Jesus would had when it was, how it would have appeared when it was circulating through the early church, unless there were eyewitnesses to the fact that Jesus really was a miracle worker. This would be nonsense to the first readers of these Gospels, that Jesus could be tempted to turn stone into bread, unless they really did know that he was a miracle worker later on. Just some things to think about as you reflect on and consider the claims of Jesus for yourself. So let's pick up the story in verse 5. So we've just had this first temptation, and the second temptation of the devil is really subtle and it's really clever. So basically the way that Jesus has resisted this temptation, when he's starving, when he's been fasting for 40 days, when he's alone and disorientated in the desert, and the devil says, turn the stones into bread, he identifies the issue of trust, and he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 8, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." So Jesus resists temptation by making his trust in God, his Father, explicit, and by quoting from the Bible. So what the devil does in the second temptation is he himself quotes from the Bible, and he makes the issue of trust the temptation. It's clever. Now, verse 5 starts with how Jesus is taken up to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. And it's kind of shrouded in this kind of mystery in terms of, did that really happen physically? Did the devil take Jesus to the top of the temple? There's no way of telling from the text. My strong personal suspicion is that this is a kind of out-of-body experience. This is something that the devil brings into the mind of Jesus, almost in sort of like a hallucination. That doesn't mean that it's not real. As any one of us knows, temptations can be very powerful when they are just a thought process, when they are just a fantasy, when we are just daydreaming. If we lie awake at night dreaming of how we would spend the millions we won on the lottery, there's a temptation that we're giving into right there. If we're tempted to imagine what this person we find attractive would look like naked, there's a temptation right there. If we imagine what it would feel like to punch somebody on the nose, that's a temptation right there. It might be happening just in our minds, but it is very, very real nevertheless. And so I think that's probably the wisest way to read of what happens in this temptation. It's very real. It may well not be a physical reality. So the devil says to Jesus in verse 6, "So if you're the Son of God," and there's always this niggling if. He says it in both of the first two temptations. This is Jesus just coming out the back of his baptism, where a voice from heaven says, "This is my Son whom I love, with him I'm well pleased." And the devil is saying, "If you are the Son of God," and just niggling away at his sense of identity. And the temptation, basically, that the devil gives Jesus is to say, look, throw yourself off the temple, because Psalm 91 says the angels will catch you on the way down. You won't hurt yourself. They won't drop you. And so the devil is manipulating this idea of Jesus putting his trust in God the Father. Jesus, in his weak and depleted state, again has to try and wrestle with, okay, how do I respond to this? And he goes back again, as he did in the first temptation, to the story of the Bible, to the story of the people of Israel. And he remembers another time that they were tempted not to put their trust in Jesus. It happened at a place called Massa. And Moses was so scared for his life, he thought they were going to stone him, because they thought they were going to basically die of thirst in the desert. And at Massa, God says to Moses, "Strike the rock with your staff," and water comes gushing out. But Massa became a place that was infamous in the history of Israel. And it's that verse that Jesus now turns to, quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, where he says, do not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massa, although he doesn't say that last part of the sentence. And basically, Jesus is resisting the temptation to manipulate God into working with his agenda. Jesus is resisting the temptation to come up with a plan to meet his own needs and expect God to support him. Ironically, that's one of the things Christians are very good at doing. We don't consult God. We come up with a plan and expect him to bless it. And that's exactly the temptation that Jesus refuses to give into. He will not fail to put his trust in God the Father like the people of Israel did in the desert. This time around, he's going to put his trust in God, and he won't allow God to be manipulated to meet his own needs. That's what's going on in this temptation. So let's just pause there for a moment and just take time to ask the question, what can we learn? I remember getting a phone call quite late one night, and as soon as I picked up the phone, I recognised the man's voice, and he was crying. And he said, "Andy, I've done it again. I'm in a hotel hundreds of miles from home. I've had a bad week. I'm lonely. And I've just slept with a woman whose name I barely know." I remember the time when a young woman in the church came to my office one morning and shaking and tearful and said, "Please, can I talk to you?" She said, "Andy, at 8 o'clock this morning, the bailiffs were banging on my door. She said, they've taken my car, my sofas and my television. They say that we owe £50,000. I knew nothing about it. My husband is at home sobbing. He has confessed to me that for years he's had an online gambling addiction, and we're now bankrupt." She said, "What do I do?" When the consequences of giving in to temptation are just so enormous, we have to work out how we're going to resist it. When succumbing to temptation is so destructive, we've got to do better in learning to resist it. So let's just think about for a moment what the normal advice is about how do you resist temptation. The first piece of advice most people give you is think about it, be rational, use your brain, think about the consequences of your actions. That's great, that's good advice. The second piece of advice, well, people say just walk away, put distance between the temptation and yourself, get out of there, like Joseph did with Potiphar's wife when Mrs. Potts got the hots. Anyway, and then so that's a good bit of advice. Then another thing people would say is distract yourself. Do something else. Have a cold shower, go for a run, do something to distract yourself. Another piece of advice would be phone a friend. That is actually a brilliant piece of advice. That's part of what the Christian community is here to do, to support one another. Phone a friend in that moment of temptation. Make yourself accountable. And of course, people will say, pray, ask God for help. Now, all of those things are good. Okay, you need to hear that, because if you don't listen to that bit, you think I'm about to talk about heresy. All of those things are really important in as far as they go. But the thing that they all have in common is that they are external, outward, temporary fixes. Whereas the root of the issue in temptation is actually always what's happening on the inside. We're only tempted when there is a stimulus on the outside that hooks into a desire on the inside. That's why all of our temptations are different. And the trouble with those solutions is they're all external fixes to actually more of an internal problem. The problem we have is that all of us have got these damaged and misaligned desires, these corners of evil in our heart that Solzhenitsyn was talking about. And we have to change the inner parts in order to get control over our external behaviors. We have to see transformation in the inner parts of who we are to actually resist temptation. So when we come to temptation, and again, hear this carefully, the issue ultimately is actually not about self-control, whatever anybody has said to you. Self-control is important, but it is not the root of the issue. And there are two roots to the issue. The first is that about our ability to put our trust in God, and the second root is about our ability to see our desires reordered. Now, the second one we're going to come to in the final week next week, but today we're going to talk about this issue that behind every temptation is an issue about our trust in God. Every time you're tempted, at the root of every time we give in to temptation, the temptation is actually rooted in this. I don't trust you, God, to provide for me in this moment. I don't trust you to resolve my need, to deal with my pain, or to make me feel safe. God, I don't trust you with my happiness. In this moment, I actually believe that I know better how to live my life than you do. I'm not going to trust you that you know best. At root, in every single temptation, is a very simple question. Do I trust God's love for me over my instincts in this moment? That's what's at stake. It's a trust issue. And that gets much deeper into the roots of how we learn to resist temptation. It's so much more than saying no in the moment. It's about learning over a lifetime to learn to trust God for everything, including our happiness. In every temptation, the issue is my confidence in God. So let me give you some practical examples of that. Let's think about that for a moment. So when we fail to declare something on our tax form, or when we fail to live generously towards others, or when we invest our pension in a non-ethical fund, actually at the root of that issue is saying, God, I don't actually trust you to be my provider. Or when shopping and owning stuff and buying things becomes our compulsion, when we have to do it to make ourselves feel better, what we're actually saying there is, God, I don't find you to bring contentment and satisfaction to my life. I need these other things. I don't trust you for my contentment, my peace, and my satisfaction. Or take for the example, when we come across really controlling, or when we behave ourselves in a really controlling and manipulative way with other people, where we set very high expectations and expect others to dance to our tune and to march to our drumbeat, when we're manipulative and controlling people, what we're actually saying is, God, I don't trust you with feeling safe. I don't trust you to look after me and to be in sovereign control of my circumstances. In all those three examples, and I could use any temptation that you could think of, at the root of it, there is always this trust issue, a failure to trust God. Now, I'm also really interested in the fact that what we have in Matthew 4 is that we see that the trust Jesus has in God leads to a profound trust for him in God's word. 3 times Jesus is tempted, and 3 times he refutes the temptation by saying, "It is written." And then he quotes from memory a passage he's learned from Deuteronomy. Jesus completely believed that God had spoken authoritatively in the scriptures. Jesus had no doubts that he trusted the word of his Father. It is written, God has spoken, and his word has authority even over how he was feeling in the moment. It's interesting that whenever Jesus quotes from the Bible, it's always to end the argument. It's always to clinch it. He understood the Bible to be the key to understanding him, and him as the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament Bible looked forward to. Jesus had had 30 years of preparation for these moments of temptation, and one of the rhythms and habits that becomes obvious to us in how he resists this temptation is that he has learnt to study and read the Bible, to memorize it, and to trust in its authority even over his own feelings. He had learnt to cultivate a lifetime of small trusts by learning to trust in the authority of the Bible. It's a fascinating thing. At the root of every temptation is the temptation that Jesus faced about a trust in God. And what we learn from Jesus is that that trust in God is expressed through a deep trust in the Bible as God's authoritative word, even over and above what we feel. So how do you and I learn to cultivate trust in our lives? Because that's absolutely key if we're going to learn to resist temptation. I've learned to admire over the years my wife's ability to trust God. And so on a walk this week, this isn't the walk where she said, asked the question, what are my three temptations? This is a walk where I said to her, so how have you learned to trust God? And she said, it's really simple for me. She said, I can't trust God unless I spend time with him. It's when I spend time with him, reading the Bible and praying, that I learn that he is actually dynamic and active and with me and present and answering prayer and changing things. And I'm seeing prayers answered. There is no trust in God without spending time with him. She said the second thing is that over time I've learned to see his faithfulness through one difficult situation after another. And she said thirdly, I learned to trust God through observing what he does in other people's lives around me. For me, it's very similar. I learned to trust God by looking back in order to look forward. It's something I've learned from the Old Testament of the Bible, where God is always saying to the people of Israel, remember in order to have courage and trust in what happens next. And just recently, I've had to do that really very deliberately. I was very daunted about a particular situation. And I've had to go back and just really rehearse what God has done in the past in order that I may face this situation with confidence. Another way that God has taught me to cultivate trust is to count my blessings, that every day look for his footprints, look for those gifts of grace and record them so that I don't lose perspective that God is present in me every day. And of course, another way to learn to cultivate trust is to embrace every moment of temptation and to think about what's happening to me right now and to trace it back to where do I not trust God for. And by learning to resist temptation, we are cultivating a lifetime of these small trusts. These are just some of the ways that we can cultivate a life of trust. But what we see in the second temptation of Jesus is that the issue of, do I trust God with my happiness? Do I trust the authority of his word even over my feelings? Lies under every temptation that we ever face. And next week we'll look at how God wants to reorder our desires to make us even more victorious in temptation. But for Keris and I, our bar has been set recently when it comes to putting our trust in God by our daughter. You know that our granddaughter died before Christmas, and at Elsie's Thanksgiving service, my daughter, Elsie's mum, stood up in the Thanksgiving service and said, I say this through gritted teeth today, but I say it nevertheless. My daughter is better off in my Heavenly Father's arms than she is in mine. It reminded me of what Jesus said from the cross as he faced death. And he simply said, "Into your hands I place my spirit." He had learnt to trust God even in the darkest of times. And one of our key areas for resisting temptation is to learn that same level of trust. This God is on our side in temptation, and he really can be trusted.